first time that I went to Worldcon. This is the big science fiction convention in the U.S. I was dreading getting back to the stairs after the Hugo Awards or getting to the elevator after the Hugo Awards, because it is, like I said, a mess often to get up the elevators. And I walked past it and saw just a big clump, a nice Israeli line, as you people just kind of fighting and waiting to get on the elevators, and I just dreaded it. So I went over and I grabbed a drink, and I'm like, all right, I have to go now. And I went back to get on the elevator, and suddenly, magically, a bunch of people in Star Trek Starfleet uniforms had arrived, organized everybody to be in an orderly line, and I thought, I'm home! Starfleet is here! So I'm very thankful for those Starfleet members from 2003 or whenever it was that I was at Worldcon. You guys are not here to hear Worldcon stories, you're here to hear a lecture from me on creative writing. What I'm going to be talking to you guys about today is plotting and building a story, kind of the way that I do it. This is not going to be a one-to-one analog, but a similar version of the lectures that I give at in my university course, which means that if you want a repeat of something like this, I usually put those on YouTube. And so you can go find the Sandrson. I think the 2016 lectures are the most recent ones that we have up there. And you can go watch those if you need more of me blabbing at you about storytelling. I'm going to start this lecture with kind of a general preface that I often give to writing lectures, which is to tell you sometimes you need to be willing to ignore me. Which is an odd way to start, right? Start by saying ignore the guy giving you the lecture. But if there is one main rule of storytelling, it is this. That there's no one way to write a story. Let me give you an example of how I learned this. So when I was trying to figure out how to learn how to write, very early in my pre-published writing career, I started to realize that a lot of authors talk about a dichotomy between the ways that people approach telling their stories. Stephen King's book on writing, which is a very good book, which I do recommend. It's either in there or another essay that I read by him at the time. I can't remember exactly where it was, but he talks about how the way he writes a story is by starting with interesting characters in an interesting situation and then letting them go. Seeing where they go, giving them lots of freedom. He says that if he has an outline, it destroys his story. Meanwhile, I was reading Orson Scott Card's How to Write Science Fiction and Fantasy, and Orson Scott Card in there talks about the importance of an outline and how if you don't have an outline, your story will be terrible. Now, you can see that these two things are mutually exclusive, right? You have on one end what we call the outliners. And by the way, I do write on the board. It's my handwriting's not legible in English, so I apologize. I'm not so great at the whole handwriting thing. It's the one thing my mom always talks about me failing in grade school was my handwriting tests. She did. She did. It makes sense. You would think that she'd be like, oh good, this is a good sign, but no. And over here we have what we call discovery writers. So outliners and discovery writers. And in reading these texts and kind of thinking about this a lot, I realized that these two things weren't mutually exclusive. They could be mutually exclusive for a given person, and some people may write more like Stephen King, and some people might write more like Orson Scott Card. And the trick is, as being a writer yourself, your job is to try a bunch of different tools that different writers talk about, experiment with your own tools that you make up, and over the course of your writing career, learn what works for you. And that should be your mantra. What works for you and creates stories for you is the right way to do it, or at least a right way to do it. You may find, and most people do, that these two tools are both useful for you. I do tend to prefer, this is how people talk about outliners, discovery writers, but George Martin has a great set of terms he uses. He calls outliners architects, and he calls discovery writers gardeners. And these are two very useful tools. Learning how to sit down and say, all right, I'm going to free write, I'm going to discovery write, I'm going to take my story and just see where it goes is a great exercise to practice doing. At the same time, practicing, I'm going to come up with a rigid structure ahead of time, and I'm going to see how a story comes out of that for me, can be very handy. Now, the truth of this is, it's a continuum. It's not, you're not one or the other. Most people use some element of both. Now, there are extreme outliners. I have a friend who comes up with his outline very point by point, and then he takes his outline and to make a book out of it, he just takes each sentence and makes it a paragraph all the way through, and then takes each paragraph and expands it to a page, and then takes each page and expands it to a chapter, and he's done with his book. And that is the most rigid form of outlining I have found. There are other people like Stephen King who just start. They have no end in mind at all, and they just start going, and when it feels like they're at the end, they end. Now, these both have advantages and disadvantages. The advantage of being an outliner is generally that since you know where you're going, you can lay your foreshadowing and groundwork really well, and outliners tend to have very explosive endings. If you've read a book where everything comes together at the end, where everything's really well foreshadowed and it all locks into place, chances are good that that author's kind of naturally an outliner. However, outliners tend to be weaker with character. A lot of times, if outliners go wrong, their characters feel wooden. Their characters don't feel like they have agency. Their characters feel like the author is writing them into a role and forcing them down a path, as opposed to letting them be breathing individuals. That's your kind of danger here. Over here in discovery writing, you find the opposite. You find that the characters seem to feel really alive and vibrant in a lot of discovery writing. You'll find that you read the book and you're like, wow, these characters just, everything is so interesting about them, but I have no idea where the story is going. And indeed, the ending tends to be pretty terrible in discovery writing. For those who like Stephen King stories, you might have noticed that sometimes his endings just kind of end. And that's a chronic symptom of discovery writing. Neither of these are wrong. Neither of these are necessarily bad. I would think that Stephen King is proud of the stories he creates, even though these stories may not do everything that every other story does. No story is going to do everything. Now, you can come up with hybrids that I would say most writers end up doing, taking a little bit from one and a little bit from another. For instance, Robert Jordan was a discovery writer who had taken one step toward outlining. This one will work. I just have to put the cap back on between moments. But if you want me to use yours, I totally will. I just have to leave the caps off as I'm gesticulating and things like that. But Robert Jordan, one step. He's mostly a discovery writer. Harriet, his wife, described Robert Jordan's process as he would call it points on the map. He would decide where he's going in general broad terms. He would say, for instance, if you're going to go on, I don't know if Israelis do road trips. Americans do road trips a lot. Right? Yeah.
It's 2 hours and we do it all the time.
Yeah. So in America, road trips kind of a thing, right? When your country is as big as ours, every summer I would leave Nebraska and drive to Idaho. My family all would, and it was a 3-day trip, right? Now, that was going kind of slowly because there were kids. We were all kids, and we were stopping at, like, national parks and things. But Harriet would always describe Robert Jordan's process as he says, I know I'm starting in Los Angeles, and I know I'm ending in New York City. And I know there are a couple places in between that I want to go. And I'm just going to kind of discovery write myself between these different points on the map. By the way, I love ice, you may want to, I may send you later just to take this whole thing and fill it. So you can kind of see that what Robert Jordan was doing with this was he was mostly using the discovery writing tools, but in order to make sure that his endings were still really strong and there were some things he could foreshadow, he would pick a certain set of things he was going to do, and he would write toward those. Has anyone read The Wheel of Time in here? Any Wheel of Time fans? I've got a little tangent for you. I got the story straight from Tom Doherty, who's the CEO of Tor Books, Robert Jordan's good friend and publisher. I said, so what really happened? And he said, okay, Jim, who's Robert Jordan's real name, was James Rigney. Jim came in and he said, Tom, I want to do an epic fantasy. I have the most brilliant epic fantasy that I want to tell. And it's about a young man who finds out he has to save the world. He goes on this quest. And in the first book, it follows the King Arthur myth, and he goes to a stone that is not a stone, because in the Wheel of Time books there's a place called the Stone, and there's a sword that's not a sword that he steals from it, and that's book 1. Now, if you guys have read The Wheel of Time, that's 3 books, right? That's what he ended up doing. That is the discovery writing side of Robert Jordan. He knew his first point on the map was to get to the Stone of Tyr and take the sword that's not a sword from the stone that's not a stone. And he planned to get there in 1 book. It took him 3. Very, very common for discovery writers. You want to guess who else is a discovery writer? George Martin. Yeah. No. And so, the fun thing, I'll finish this Robert Jordan thing, is Tom Doherty looked at me and said, Brandon, I thought I was so smart. I said to Jim, why don't I sign you for 6 books? Because I knew that Jim usually took longer to get where he wanted to go in stories than he was expecting. And Tom said, I thought I was so smart, I thought I was buying the whole series for sure. For those who haven't read it, The Wheel of Time is 14 novels. And Jim was like, oh, it's a trilogy. It's totally a trilogy. I can do this in 3. Yeah. Now, my process that I'm going to talk about a lot more today is actually coming out from the other direction. Ooh, this is a better pen. I'm an outliner who's taken 1 step toward discovery writing. And for me, what I find is the biggest thing I want to shore up is the character. I want to make sure that I'm writing well, intricately plotted books that come to a really powerful conclusion, but that you never feel like the character had to be someone other than who they were to get there. The biggest danger is that readers will read your story and they'll say, I feel like this isn't what the character would do, it's just what the author wanted the character to do. And that is a real danger. But we're going to talk about both extremes and about some middle road sort of things that you can try in your own writing. My goal today is to come out of this in 48 minutes plus 30 minutes of Q&A, with you kind of having some different tools to try to practice these different styles of writing so that you can eventually arrive at whatever your own sort of perfect way of telling a story is. Most of it is going to focus on my method, however. So what is Brandon's method? Let's talk about it. So Brandon's method is to, number 1, always have ice water handy. But Brandon's method involves me wanting to make sure that my outline feels organic. When I was in high school, I was taught what an outline should be. I don't know if they teach it the same way over here, but it was like heading 1, subheading 1.1, subheading 1.1.1, creating an outline. That is not what one of my book outlines looks like. Because I like explosive endings, I tend to outline my books backward and then write them forward. And so the first thing that I do when I'm coming up with a story is I try to identify what the most powerful moments are going to be. Now, normally when I'm starting a book, what I've been doing for many months, perhaps many years, is I've been going over some of the key visual moments and key decision moments for the characters in the book. Usually I put on music, I go for a walk, I go run on the treadmill, I do something like this, and I am imagining the powerful moments that are going to make this story work. They're going to make everything come together and make this story sing. Now, I don't always have all of the powerful moments that are going to be in a book before I start. But it's really essential to me to be asking myself, these are basically the why am I writing this book? Why am I writing this book? What are the, oh, I went back to the bad one. Yeah, that's good. If I need the other colors, I'll go to those. Why am I writing? Why, what is my goal? What is making me excited? For me, it's usually not things about theme, though maybe we'll talk about theme later on. Usually it's me saying, all right, why am I writing? There's the moment where, you know, Calvin picks up a spear again, right? The moment where Calvin picks up a spear again, that is a moment that I am pushing, going to write this entire book toward. What am I going to do? You know, what's another moment I'm writing this whole book for? I'm writing this whole book for, to not give too many spoilers, to reveal that Yasna gives Shalon at the end of The Way of Kings, right? I'm writing toward that. I'm writing toward the moment where Dalinar confronts Sadeas at the end of the book, right? These are like my three powerhouse moments that are really making my story come together and are really making me say, I don't know what I'm going to do to get there, but I need these powerful moments. These basically are like Robert Jordan's points on the map for me. Powerfully emotional moments that I've played over in my head 100 times while I've been planning. And then I start to look for plot archetypes. One of the best things you can do if you're worried about your ability to outline is to start noticing, do you need a cup of water? We've got lots up here. Okay. Start noticing plot archetypes in films and books that you're experiencing and in television shows. And media starting to be someone who can analyze what's happening and why this piece of media has the effect over you it does. Most important thing for your study and practice I think you can do. This comes into a concept that I like to call being a chef and not a cook. Now those two words are basically synonyms in English, but I'm going to define them here in a specific way that isn't necessarily the absolute way you have to define them. But for the purpose of this conversation, when I'm actually making food, I am a cook and not a chef. If you give me a recipe, I can follow that recipe pretty well, and I will usually get the thing that the recipe says that I'm supposed to be making. But if something goes wrong, if I'm at the wrong elevation for that recipe, if my oven has a different temperature, if I end up accidentally putting too much flour in, what I get at the end, I will have no idea what I did wrong, right? I don't know what these pieces of a recipe are actually doing. I just know that if I plug them all in, I get this thing at the end. Too many writers learn to be cooks instead of chefs when it comes to writing their stories. What a chef will do is if you're baking something, you're going to make a cake, you're going to make cookies, whatever. The chef knows, oh, this much flour does this certain thing to the final cake that I'm making. And if I add an extra egg, it's going to have this effect. And if I add this extra bit of baking powder, it's going to do this. And the chef can put all of this together, can look at a recipe and say, no, that's not going to work for what I want. I'm going to take out this line, and I'm going to substitute something else. And at the end of the day, the master chef is able to work on the fly and create the cake exactly the way they want to make it, rather than the way that a recipe says it has to be made. Too many people, like I said, when it comes to plot archetypes, for writers, they don't know what the different pieces of the plot are doing. They don't know why you're doing these different things. And at the end, you can sometimes follow a plot archetype and end up with your story, you end up with your cake, and it can work. And you can write a good story that way, but you will never have the control over that story that you will have if you start to learn to identify what the different pieces of the story do and why they do what they do. And the best way to start learning to be a chef instead of a cook when it comes to writing stories is to start experiencing media, going to movies, see your favorite movies, sit down after, take out a notebook and say, what were the moments that I loved the most? What did the filmmaker, particularly the screenwriter, since you're writers learning, what did they do to set this up? What did they do to create this emotion? Can I strip it down from the trappings and turn it into the core idea that I love? We're going to take this for right now for three different types of stories, one of them being one of mine. I'm going to show you how one of these plot archetypes can be applied in different ways. And this plot archetype is what we call the underdog sports story. We're gonna maybe I'm gonna use the different colors now because we're going into something else. So we're just gonna take one of these plot archetypes, underdog. All right. So underdog sports stories are very, very common in cinema. It's one of the reasons I picked this. Most everyone, if you watch movies, has probably seen some sort of underdog sports story narrative. They aren't always sports stories. For instance, the singing competition one about the people, what was it called?
Pitch Perfect.
What's that? Pitch Perfect. Pitch Perfect. Those are underdog sports stories, right? Even though they're actually a different sort of contest. And let me ask you guys. I'm not sure, if you guys have seen all the cinema that I have. We are in a room with lots of movie posters, though. So I do have to say, one of these things is not like the other, right? Right? We've got a bunch of classic, genre-defining films and Speed. I like Speed. I really like John Reed. It's a great film, but it's with Charlie Chaplin and Taxi Driver and Metropolis. So someone must just really like Speed. Sorry, Fiona, if you're watching this, your movie is great. So let me ask you this. What are the points that make an underdog sports story come together? Is anyone thinking about this? What are some of the elements?
You need to have a failure. You
Yes.
need to have the moving speech by the coach.
Moving speech. Yep. Okay, I'm gonna write these down. You got it. So these are near the end. We've got to have a failure. A big failure usually happens right before the last competition, right? So if you have like 5 competitions, 5 stages, they're going to fail usually at competition number 4 before the big competition, right? And then you can also have the moving speech.
A touching family moment where the mother shows support after
Yeah.
they were against.
Yeah, touching family moment is perfect. Yeah, what's that?
Discovering yourself.
Oh yeah, discovering who you really are. Good, discover.
Reading the competition.
Yeah,
Getting consulted by a successful guy.
Yeah, so usually the meeting competition, I'll get to the hands in a second, but usually you have several meetings, right? That means competition. So what you usually have is you're going to see them at the beginning and they're going to be all cool, right? They're going to like walk on stage and they're just going to nail the singing competition, or they're going to win, or they're going to be after a game and they're going to saunter by and they're going to be so awesome, but they're also going to be enormous jerks, right? So we're going to build rooting interest for our underdog sports story, but before that, usually you're going to show our team sucks. Right? So you first show our team sucks, but then you show how big of a jerk this other group is, so you're like, I don't care if our team sucks, we gotta beat them. Alright, there's a hand in the back, go ahead, yeah.
Sometimes the hero is discouraged or prohibited.
Yes, discouraged hero, prohibited, perfect. Excellent, what else we got right there? Training montage. We have montage. Yes, I don't ask for montage. Go ahead.
There's a very strong reason to succeed.
Yes, you're right. Usually the core character has some sort of strong reason to succeed. These are not in order anymore. So usually there is some sort of key thing that makes it personal to the main character or to the team, like a rivalry with the biggest jerk on the other team, or, you know, or the coach. Yeah, usually in here also, what happens, you'll notice that almost all the time they lose, like competition number 4 out of 5, which means they can't go on to the finals. But then what happens? Someone's disqualified. Yes, there's almost always a disqualification. Usually this happens where you can just call it, if you watch these things, to have this low moment. They want to have the lowest moment for the team, which is like, you're out, you're done. And then they find out the other team was cheating. They were all, instead of being high school students, they were all like professional athletes wearing school kid outfits. And no one noticed that they're 6 feet tall instead of, you know, 8-year-olds. But, you know, in the joke ones, that's what they do, yeah.
So usually the POV character is a newcomer or outsider.
Yes, POV is a newcomer, you're totally right. All right. Any others you want to add up on here?
Love story between two people from the
Yeah, often there's a love story. So often it's like the newcomer with like the old leader of the team who's been humbled in some way, or it's sometimes between the 2 different teams. There's almost always one of these, particularly if it's focused on teams.
They bring in someone who's very talented but problematic.
Yes.
Personality.
Yes. A new problematic member. Usually there's some really, they don't always bring them in as new. Sometimes they're already on the team. Cool Runnings is like this. You find out that each of the team members is highly problematic in some way, but really skilled in some other way. And so the newcomer is usually becomes the leader of the team and the soul of the team. Their job is to channel all of the different talents of all of the people who everyone else thought just couldn't do this. Yeah.
Funny, friendly sidekick.
Yep, funny sidekick. At least 1, sometimes 2. All right, right over here.
Usually the ending would either be like a cathartic winning, or just, well, friendship was the most important thing, so we just
Yeah, you're actually right. So it depends on if you want an Oscar or not. If you want an Oscar, the characters lose, but realize something else they wanted all along. This is Rocky, right? Which won an Oscar. If you want to just make it feel good, you have them win using some sort of unexpected talent of one of the characters. This is where Happy Gilmore has taught himself how to putt. Or this is where, you know, one of the team members has always been an expert rapper, and for some reason it comes down to a rap battle at the end. Or, you know, Napoleon Dynamite dances on stage. It's not really an underdog sports story, but something weird happens like that. We're here and here.
Somebody decided to leave the team.
Yes. Yes. And it's often the leader, isn't it? Usually they get everyone else going, but then they get discouraged and leave the team and have their moment.
You're the one with the hidden talent nobody knew about.
Hidden talents. Yeah. Okay, we can keep on going forever. We'll stop here. I'm sorry. You can think of your own. You're supposed to be thinking of your own. Now, you've already taken step 1 toward becoming chefs by doing this. When you take a movie or something you really love, you can identify kind of what it's doing. You first write all this stuff down. I'll get my friends together and we'll brainstorm it. But then you want to take the next step of question. You want to be asking yourself, why is the big failure important? Let me ask you this. Why is the big failure important? Was success after failure? It is more emotional, right? Yeah, it raises the stakes for you if you see them fail first.
Overcome the crisis.
Yes, overcome the crisis. It can show the characters coming together, and you can really see. Yeah.
Character.
Yes. Yep. Go ahead.
Great opportunity for character progression.
Character progression. You can see how they are when they're down. Yeah.
There's a reversal of expectations. Like when you see that your team's terrible, and suddenly they look like they're going to win, and they lose again, and they suddenly pull it out at the end. That is a build-up tension.
Right. You usually, in a story, you may have seen sometimes this thing. I don't know, the rising tension of a story. I don't know if you've ever seen that. People often talk about a story is best like this. Really, the truth is, stories work best like that, with larger peaks and valleys. The idea that you don't want your story to have a single emotional beat or a single emotional resonance. You have this problem a lot in thrillers, where people will write their thriller and they learn how to use the tools really well, which is to end every chapter with a cliffhanger, have the chapters be really short, and have the characters constantly be in danger and constantly not finding the thing that they're looking for. Dan Brown does this very well. But a lot of people have a point where in the thriller, where if the author takes it too long, you've been at the rising tension the whole time with no big peaks and valleys, that people are like, I'm just done. I'm done with this story. I don't care anymore because I'm feeling one emotion and it's not changing and things like this. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead in the back. Oh, you weren't raising your hand. That's okay. Go ahead.
It allows for an opportunity for characters to showcase hidden abilities.
Yeah, it does. It absolutely does. Really, this big moment failure is a lot of things. One of them it proves to the character, to the reader, the audience, how the characters have grown. Because usually you have a point where they give up near the beginning after the first time the coach or the new member tries to get them together, and then they just all fall apart, and the coach has to bring them together. Usually at the big failure, not always, but usually it's the coach or the new member who's like, I'm done, we're out, but the rest of the team is still strong. And this is what, the old adage, which is really useful in writing, is show, don't tell. Now really, the don't shouldn't be there, because telling is really handy as a writer. It is, show is better than tell in most situations, but tell is a lot faster. And sometimes you just want to tell. But oftentimes your most powerful moments you want to show, because if you can show that the team has become strong, what happens during that big failure is the audience says they deserve to win. Up here I was rooting for them because they were the protagonists. Now I see that they have become stronger than their conflict because they are knit together. And I see a true, I have been proven to me that they have become people who deserve to win. And that moment is really important for earning your ending. And if you're writing and you don't understand how important that moment can be for your given story, not every one of you needs this, obviously, but if your story archetype is going this way, and you then have the whole team fall apart at that point, but then just get back together for no good reason, I bet you can think of films where this sort of things happen, where the screenwriter knows everything needs to fall apart, the characters just go their own separate ways, it doesn't prove anything to you, but then the big disqualification comes, they just kind of come back together and then go win. Where it's much more powerful if you get shown something about how they're like, you know what, we're a family now, and the character who, the hero falls away is pulled back in by their magnetism when that character was pulling them together at the beginning. It's a really great moment. That some shows squander because they don't understand what their movie's trying to do. This is not to say that every one of these has to follow the same archetype, right? This isn't to say you have to do it that way. But as a chef, you can know what the spice that you're putting into the stew you're cooking does. You can say, I connect why I want to have the team be strong. Even though writers often say, oh, your lowest moment should be your absolute lowest. Do everything you can to break them apart, right? But that's not right for this story. That's what it comes down to. You need to ignore the person giving you advice sometimes and trust your own instincts. Sometimes kicking them when they're down serves no purpose other than to break your story further apart. Sometimes it's exactly what you need. Now we take all of this, and I'm going to talk about, those who watch my lectures know probably what I'm going to talk about, but there are two stories that follow this archetype that you may not be thinking of. One is Ender's Game. People don't look at Ender's Game and say that's an underdog sports story, but it is. You can find most of these points, not all of them, on there. Now Scott Card knows which of these to use for his story and which of them not to. And he didn't use every one of these, because as a chef, he looks at all the tropes and archetypes of the story he's telling and says, I see what this one does. I see that having the character have everyone taken away from him so he's by himself really isolates Ender and makes this really strong, but then at the end, they all have to come back, and all the people he's trained then have to help, because it shouldn't be him doing it on his own because it's a story about a team, right? And so Scott knows to use that archetype rather than other parts of the archetype. And it makes for a really powerful story, and you don't go into Ender's Game saying, oh, I'm watching an underdog sports story. The other one, of course, is The Way of Kings. This is the Bridge 4 sequence of The Way of Kings, right? Now, people don't read that and say, wow, this is an underdog sports story. Most people don't. Chefs do. Chefs go into it and say, oh, I see what you're doing here, Sanderson. I see how instead of a singing battle, it's about people at war, but it's using the same fundamental concepts and asking, why are each of these important, and building a story around it. This can be really handy in a science fiction and fantasy, particularly a big epic fantasy. A lot of times, big epic fantasies get lost in their own epicness, right? It's a really big danger, and this is where your story doesn't have a continual plot through line on any specific archetype because it's so big. And you'll notice with the Stormlight Archive, I usually pick one thing like this for one through line, and I let the other plot lines be a little less archetypal. I didn't use a specific archetype for Shalon and Jasna. I was working from a different, so I'll tell you how I did that in a minute, but I was working from a different sort of outline that I was working for here, where I was like, I want to have resonant beats because Way of Kings is so big, and there's so much going on. I want you to be able to pick out one familiar story, even if the reader doesn't actually acknowledge consciously what type of story it is. They've got something to latch onto, and their instincts for stories say, I know kind of what's coming. I can anticipate these beats, even though the story is weird, this planet is weird, and these characters are way out there. I've got something to hang on to. I find it really handy for epic fantasy, but it's really handy for a lot of things. Yeah, Miss Bard's an underdog story, but instead of an underdog sports story, it's an apprentice master story. It's the apprentice becoming the master, which is a very similar archetype to this, but usually focuses on two characters instead of, even though there's a whole team, the team isn't as involved in what Vin and Kelsey are doing, and so it's a slightly different archetype. But yes, it absolutely follows one of those archetypes. Skyward follows the archetype that I like to call a boy and his dragon. It's the archetype of How to Train Your Dragon. It's the archetype of Dragon's Blood by Jane Yolen. It's the archetype of Aragon. And I looked at all of those, and I'm like, I love these. Can I do one like this, but that distills it down to what I love, and then builds it back up into something different? And that's the real key. Whenever I talk about archetype, I worry that people will be too slavish to any one of these things, where that's not the goal. The goal of doing this is to have you say, hey, I can identify all these, and I can start to think about which parts of this I love, and which parts feel cliche, right? When you're watching the movie, and the failure happens right when you expect it to, in the way you expect it to, and then it just doesn't have any emotional impact to you, you might then say, they did this in a cliched way, how can I do it, but make it work? So, this is really key in the way that I understand story. One of the things you'll find talking to a lot of professional writers is that a lot of the stuff we're talking about in here is not stuff they do or want to do while they're actually writing. This stuff is all stuff you do in the outlining stage, or if you're a discovery writer, in the revision stage. I have a lot of friends who are discovery writers who write their whole story, step back and say, what kind of plot archetype was I channeling without realizing it? Go through and find out, say, wow, this would be really a lot stronger if I added this element or this element and took this element away. And they revise their story to an outline or to powerful moments and have a story that comes together just as well as any outline story. They just do it in revision. So really, the difference between outliners and discovery writers happens whether you want to do the upfront work or the post work. And you can make any story work. Then you can write it in a way that no one can tell which one you are if you're doing it the right way. So, plot archetypes, and then I'll put up the third thing I'm kind of looking for, which are types of progress. So, when I'm plotting and building a story, I use 3 key concepts. Oh man, 20 minutes left, okay. And then Q&A. I'm gonna go to red over here. So I use 3 key concepts to be my fundamental, overriding, driving force for creating a story. And these are promise, progress, payoff. This is what drives plots in a story. If you understand promise, progress, payoff in the right way, then what you're going to have is you're going to have a story that works on a just plot, chapter by chapter basis. Now, promise, progress, payoff. What does this mean? This means that stories, plots are built around early moments where you give a promise. We talked about seeing the other team, who's all arrogant and awesome, walking in. What is the promise of that scene? Yeah, no, you're going to take them down by the end, right? If the promise is, that's the immediate promise. The immediate promise is this, and that's good to be thinking about, but the promise is usually going to mean we're going to see these people at the end humbled, because we are deliberately showing how arrogant they are right now that they need to be brought down. That your payoff then is paying off your promise in a way, if you can make it work, that is surprising yet inevitable. Easy words to say, hard words to pull off. We'll talk about doing that. But you make a promise at the beginning of a story. For instance, one of my favorite stories of all time is Star Wars, which people have rebranded A New Hope, or George did years ago, but Star Wars. What is the promise of Luke Skywalker stepping up onto the hills and looking at the suns?
Going out there.
He's going to go up there, right? He is a person whose heart desires to be in the sky. And the promise is he's going to fly out and explore the world and probably be in a fighter jet or a starfighter by the end of this, right? These really powerful moments at the beginnings of stories are giving us promises, and they're not always verbal promises, sometimes they're tone promises. This is why you often see a prologue at the beginning of an epic fantasy, particularly one that's going to start a little slower. What do? The writer says, oh man, my story is not actually about farming, but my first chapter has the kid farming and then getting interrupted. I want everyone to know my story is about magic and about, things blowing up into fallen rising kingdoms. What am I going to do? You write the prologue to Eye of the World, right? Which, if you haven't read it, it starts off with the fallen rising kingdoms and powers and people going mad, and then you jump to Kid on a Farm. He very quickly gets off Kid on a Farm, but that's what the promise is doing, is setting a tone promise. In case you were worried, this story is actually about wizards. It's not about farming. Not that there's anything wrong with farming. Stardew Valley's great. So that's your promise. Now, where people get lost is in the progress. To have a plot that works really well, one of the things you need to understand is you, as an author, have absolute control over the progress of your story. You have absolute control of the pacing of your story, and it's really easy to make things progress. People always complain about science fiction and fantasy, saying, oh, that's the genre where you can just invent everything you want to save the ending very easily, right? I don't know if you've heard this, but people complain, oh, there's Deus Ex Machina. That's a phrase that just means people invent endings and they solve everything with magic. The truth is you can do that in any book. It's no less of a Deus Ex Machina if you're writing a romance and then they don't like each other, and then you write, overnight she decided she fell in love with him and they got married. Totally unsatisfying, but you can do it. You can do it in one sentence. As an author, you can make one sentence pass 1,000,000 years. Each of you could do it easily, and 1,000,000 years passed. Or you can take one moment and describe it in 500 pages if you wanted to. I bet you would all be up to that challenge. It'd get boring pretty quick, but you describe every little detail in the room in that one moment. You have control over pacing and plot, absolutely. So your job for this, for progress, is to do what I call giving them a sense of progress. This is convincing the reader that things are moving toward an ending. This is not necessarily just writing that ending. So every type of progress you have is really helpful in cueing the reader toward things happening. One of my favorite examples of how to explain this is, there's a book I really enjoy called Inferno by Larry Niven and Jerry Cornell. A lesser-known work of theirs. It's about a science fiction writer who's at a convention, gets drunk at a party, falls out the window, dies, and wakes up in Dante's Inferno. Right? And hell as described by Dante's Inferno. And this guy is kind of arrogant, and he's not terrible, but he's kind of an arrogant jerk, like authors tend to be. And the story follows where he goes from vignette to vignette in Dante's Inferno in the different parts of hell, basically goes to a new area, meets some famous historical figure who's been sent to hell. They help him get through that part of hell, and then he moves to the next part of hell and has another wacky adventure with Billy the Kid or something like that, right? And it's very fun because you're getting all these cameos, and they're not necessarily saying who they are, but you can pick it out from the details and things like this. But I read this book, and I was rapt the entire time. I was pulled from beginning to end. And afterward, I said to myself, that story should not have held my attention the way it did, because really, it was just a series of vignettes. And this is usually something you want to avoid in writing. You want your story to feel like it's escalating, where each experience is building on the one before, that you're having a complete narrative that is going somewhere rather than happening, 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 happening. But the truth is, most stories are a bunch of isolated incidents that the author arranges in a way to give you a sense that they're building towards something. How did Inferno do this? It had a map. Now, the map is something that goes in fantasy and science fiction books, sometimes in a sort of cook sort of way. People are like, well, Tolkien had a map, let's put in a map, right? But in Inferno, what happened is, the map of Dante's Inferno was a giant circle with something at the center, and the character was working his way toward the center, where in Dante's actual Inferno, the devil is. And because I could watch the character's progress toward the center, that gave me a sense that each of these vignettes was building on each other, because the character was getting one step closer to their goal each time. And this is why travelogues, maps for fantasy work so well, is because oftentimes you will have, I don't generally write these, but there are a lot of great travelogue books. The David Eddings series were all built around this. Even Tolkien was basically built around this. Because you can set up a goal and show the characters getting closer with each chapter, or sometimes getting pulled away and having to work their way back and regain ground, you as a reader have an innate sense of how the story is building on itself. And it's really an easy way to do it. I suggest you think of that when you're building a sense of progress, this map. That doesn't mean each of your stories need to be travelogues. What I want you to identify is how, oh, I wrote with the Sharpie. That's right. Yeah, they come off if you just use this stuff. What's that?
The one that's not going to be.
Yeah. I've done this on my own in my class before. The janitors get really good at getting rid of these things. This is the danger with carrying Sharpies in your pocket. Erase that. How to tell if someone's an experienced professor. You ask them, how often do they write with Sharpie on the board? Not what do you do if it ever happens. So your goal as a writer is to figure out how to make a sense of progress for the type of story you're telling. Doesn't mean you have to have a travelogue. So I would like you to start learning to identify what types of progress your story is going to have in it, right? And how you can build payoff and a promise for that. And there are tons of different types. I'm going to write a few on the board. You should spend your time watching movies and reading books and watching television shows and identifying what type they have. But we have the mystery. right? A mystery is where information, this is a specific type of a mystery, but where information is your promise, your progress, and your payoff. If you have a mystery, then the character's discovering that there is something they don't know. Somebody's been killed and somebody did it. Your sense of progress, then is clues along the way, and your payoff is the information you've been wanting all along, which is who did it, right? It seems really simple when I put it that way, but so many books misidentify what their sense of progress is, and therefore have a plot where readers read it and they're like, I don't feel like I know where it's going. I don't feel like it's going anywhere. It's not coming together. I'm lost. Because oftentimes that writer is writing, for instance, a mystery, but they are focusing all their time on the travel log. And the reader is not feeling like any progress is being made toward the mystery because they're traveling somewhere, right? You have the travel log, you have the relationship, you have just, I have a podcast called Writing Excuses. We spent an entire year, if you write down the term elemental genres, and you Google that with writing excuses, we spent every month, we took one of these style of plots, like thrillers or mysteries or sense of wonder, the heist story, and we did some of the breaking down the archetypes and also some of the progress and payoff that makes those work. But what I'm generally doing when I'm building a story is I've got these three things, right? I have my powerful moments in my head. I have my plot archetype, main one or sub ones I'm using. And I have the types of progress. For the underdog sports story, the types of progress might be the 5 big games. If you set up at the beginning, there are 5 games, and if you win every one of them, you get to take home the trophy. Then you have set up your progress. But it might just be one game. For Rocky, it's, hey, there's the big fight that I need to win against the champion. If I can qualify and make that fight and beat him, then I will succeed in my story. It may just be one fight. You find out what it is, and you indicate to the reader early on what you're going to be doing. So then, finally, at long last, we come to how Brandon builds his outline. And what I will generally do is I'll take my outline, and I have for my outline up in the corner, I have plot, setting, character. I think I didn't spell that right. So plot, setting, character, right? So what I tend to do is, we're only talking about plot today. I will spend as much time on setting and character as I spend on plot in my outline. Though character's a little different, I'll tell you that in a minute. So under the plot heading, where we are now, I will write my archetypes. And I'll be like, here's archetype number 1. Underdog sports. And then I'll go through all the points of the main kind of summary of the outline I want to use. And then at the bottom, we have our big moment. Right? And I've got, all right, big moment, and there probably is like a mini big moment in here. And that, and things like this. Like mini big moment might be, all right, Calvin has decided to give it one more try. He steps away from the chasm, and we have just ended Act 1, right? I don't necessarily use the 3-act format a lot. Some people do. It's a handy thing, but kind of, you know, first part is Kaladin deciding. Second part is Kaladin focusing on the team and pulling them together. And then the final part is our big climax and conclusion. So I've got this. And then I also start identifying my progress types. And for instance, for Shalon, I had a mystery, right, under her plotter type. And then I put underneath it all of the clues. Clues, 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 clues with reveal. Right? And then I also put relationship here. Yeah? With Shalon and Yasna. They are having a rocky relationship. It's a mentor and apprentice sort of thing, but there's event, big event at the end, right? And the things I'm working to. And usually a book will have like 10 different progress types for a big epic fantasy. For something shorter, there might be 5 or 6, but I often have multiple mysteries. For instance, we have a mystery in Kaladin's plotline of what happened on the day that he got turned into a slave. We start the book not knowing that, and I use a flashback sequence, which is primarily a mystery plot, to show what is the information that brought Kaladin to the point that we find him in the first actual Kaladin chapter, where he's a slave in the slave wagon. How did we get there? And so all of these different things are bullet points and headings with big reveals or big moments at the end. And so if you look at one of my outlines, again, it doesn't look like subheading 1, sub B. It has a big sort of overview here, and it has a whole bunch of progress types and the things I'm trying to achieve, and my goals, my feeling goals that I want the reader to have as they're going through this, and how they're going to clue in that we're making progress. And then at the end, I want the reveal to generally be a little bit surprising. Usually this is a matter of being a stage magician. Stage magician, when I say that, you notice how if you watch someone, there's a stage magician doing like the 3-cup routine where the balls are popping out of places and you're like, wow, it's magic. What they're doing is they're using their left hand to hide the balls inside the cups as they're moving, but you're watching their right hand because they're shaking a cup or something. This is how you pull off big reveals that are surprising, yet inevitable. You have all the pieces there. People are going to start to connect them unless you throw in a few red herrings or you distract them a little bit and stuff like this. Much easier to do than you think it is. Get this down first. Don't worry if as a new writer, you're writing this and people are reading it there and the answer is, you know, I saw that coming, but it was super satisfying when it happened. You are in such good shape when that happens, because it's only a small step to start making it more surprising if that's what you want to do. The truth is, not every story has to be surprising. When I pick up a Jane Austen novel, I know what I want at the ending. I don't have to be surprised. I just want to enjoy the journey getting there and have each of these elements along the way not feel cliched, to feel really rooted in character development. And this is where the character comes into it. If you have this whole big list and you make the characters fulfill these things and they're just in these roles, that's when it starts to feel cliched. But if you make them real characters, which we don't have time to talk about character setting too much today, because, you know, usually I do 13 weeks in my course, but you can go watch the lectures online talking about character. Your whole goal with your character is to make sure that they feel real and in control of their story, rather than making them feel like pawns on a board. And if you do that right, then at the end, if you get the expected, promised ending, and the reader gets it and is satisfied, doesn't matter if you surprise them. Now, some of you will really like surprising them, and that's okay. But learn how to be satisfying and interesting and make your points of progress along the way really work, and you will have this down, I promise you. You don't have to worry about twists until you are good at getting a satisfying conclusion, all right? And then you can really add in those twists, and they get really fun to do as you do that. Now, what do I do with character? I'm going to end this lecture by explaining how my one step toward discovery writing works. The way I do this is I've done all of this, and under the character heading, I focused on who is the character, who are they when the story starts, where do I think they're going. And I don't spend as much time on the end of the character. I say who are they and where are they going. Then I generally write a few chapters from their viewpoint, and I try to nail how they feel as a character and see if this trajectory is the right trajectory. If it's not, I go back to the outline and I try again. I tried 3 different bins for Mistborn. 3 different first chapters with a completely different personality for Vin and a very different way of seeing the world before I landed on the one that felt right. And this is more of an instinct thing. And then I went back and rebuilt my outline for that character, because the character that she ended up being is not someone who would do some of the things I said in the story. rebuilt the outline, and then I started writing her viewpoints. And after the first chunk, I went back to the outline, and I had to throw out a bunch of these things because she had become someone different. And so, like one of the progress types, instead of being, her taking over the team, it became she has to realize that it's worth loving, having, again, and to risk having pain because of it. She has to learn the lesson that Kelsier learned, or that it was better to love and lost to never have loved at all, which is not romantic love in this book. It's a matter of being willing to accept friends and accept the danger that comes with relying on people, which she had been trained to not do. And that became a major part of the story, was not there in the first outline. Was there after I wrote her for a while. And so with me, what an outline is, it's a back and forth of going to this text, writing the text, coming back to the outline, seeing where we're going, revising the outline to the character, or if the character is just not working for the story, saying, that's a great character, I'll use them in a different book that I can build around them, and I'll put someone new in this role and start again. And that happens once in a while too. So, that is the fire hose of information in one of my lectures. I apologize for just kind of turning that on you, but right now I'm going to let you guys just ask questions. It does not have to be about this. It does have to be about writing in this session. So don't ask me detailed cosmic things this time. We can do it in the next Q&A. And we'll work our way kind of from the front back, but I'll get to everybody. Well, not everybody, but I'll get to every group, every region of the group.
You said about Inferno that you felt it shouldn't have gripped you as it did. But what if I want to write a picaresque character? My favorite book is The Fashion Fold book.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a picaresque. Alice in Wonderland, maybe as well, American Gods, or...
Yeah. That is okay if you go into it. See, this is where you have to be willing to ignore the guy on the stage. Really, your goal is to create the type of art you want to create. And if you are creating the type of art you want to create, you haven't failed if it doesn't connect with some people. And that is something you should be completely comfortable doing. Like Way of Kings, I did some things that most people shouldn't do for Way of Kings, which is start with 4 prologues, basically, right? Because we have the prelude, we have Zeph, we have Sen. I guess there's 3 prologues, and then finally we get Kaladin, right? So we don't get our main character until chapter 4, and the first 3 characters either are not main characters or they die. Which is a terrible idea in most stories, because it just gives you a big road bump to getting into it. But Way of Kings I released at a time where I knew people already trusted me as an author, and that this would have huge payoffs, and if they put in the investment at the beginning to deal with this and the fact that Kaladin is a slave with depression in a terrible situation that's going to kick you in the face multiple times in the first 10 chapters, that stuff all has huge payoff. Writing what you want to write is a different art form than a lot of what I talked about here, though it can use these in microcosm and create some great stories of their own. And so don't feel that you have to be slavish to any one thing. If you want to create a picaresque, it's like here, a lot of Asimov, like for instance, Foundation is a picaresque, and it's one of the great science fiction series of all time. He used one framing device, which is kind of the, what we call the sense of progress for that was the countdown, right? Normally when you have a countdown, it starts, it's like, in 2 days, the city will get nuked if we don't stop this. He said, in 10,000 years, the foundation will happen, we'll make, New Galactic Empire rise, and then just showed all these stories for all those thousands of years and had a very sort of wandery pace, but a brilliant book. So if you want to do that, don't let anyone tell you you shouldn't do that. Learn to create the art you want. Your goals are more important than external goals. For instance, there might be people in this room who are like, I just want to do better role-playing games. Brandon, I don't want to write epic fantasy novels. I want to be a better GM. So for you, some of these things that we talk about aren't as necessary, but you can sure take that sense of progress for a character, and instead you can dole out clues, or you can dole out rewards, so that the player knows what they want to become, and they get to see their character becoming that thing, and that is just so much fun and role-playing. So you can use what is useful to you, don't use what isn't. You don't have to be like me doing a professional novelist who's writing a book every year. You might be like, I'm going to write a book every 10 years. And so sometimes the advice I will give you on things is bad advice, because you're like, I don't need to write a book this year, Brandon. I can take some time. So, yeah. All right, go ahead. in this sort of plot that I'm discovering, where would the villain come in? It depends on the archetype that I'm playing with, and it depends on some of the progress types. Like, if the main villain is a viewpoint character who has their own plot and things like that, in my outline, they'll, under the character heading, we'll have them, and they'll have a sense of progress of their own, the things they're trying to achieve, and what I'm going to show. It depends on how many viewpoints I give them. For instance, in a lot of my books, Way of Kings is an example, the antagonist is on screen but not having a viewpoint. The exception is Elantris, where the antagonist has a main viewpoint. And a lot of times in my books, I'm dealing with the overcoming an external antagonist and things, but there are different ways to do that.
Could you just repeat
Yeah, I'm going in the front first, so don't worry, I will get back to you, but just so you know.
Repeat the questions?
Oh, repeat the questions. Good idea. Yeah.
Alcatraz is
Yes.
one of the best narratives I've read. How do you choose your voice and how do you set up the tone?
Yeah. So the question is, how do I choose my voice and set up the tone for a character? She really likes the narrator of the Alcatraz books, Alcatraz himself. So this is part of that experimenting with character that I do. I rarely start a book where I haven't done a few tries at a character's voice. And when I'm trying to write, for instance, I said the 3 different versions of Vin, the main thing I was looking for was the voice and the feel of her narrative. We don't have time to go into it too much today, but I often say the best and greatest skill a fantasy novelist can learn, the most important thing is the ability to get across character and setting while talking about describing the world. So when you have a character, like in The Wheel of Time, who describes a bottle of water as this, I can't believe they left this valuable thing sitting out on the table. They walk in a room, the first thing they notice is there's a bottle of water there, and the second thing they notice is where are all the exits? That character has evoked a character to you. You know who they are, but what they've done is they've described the room and one of the objects in the room. They've never told you, I'm a soldier who always wants, who's a little bit antsy about knowing where my escape routes are, and in my culture, water's very valuable. You've got setting, you've got character, all through describing a bottle of water and some doors. And so what I'm looking for is primarily that. How is this character going to describe the world, the setting, in a way that evokes who they are and their culture? All right, go ahead.
About the promises and when you break the promise, how does
breaking promise? Yeah.
The promise of the story and how to do it right?
Yes, good question. So how do you break the promise of the story and how do you do it right? There are a lot of different ways to do this. I can't get into all of them. One of the most classic ways, however, is you can learn from Rocky and you can learn from other things where you are setting out a promise that the reader is going to accept is the promise of the story, but then the work you're doing underneath it is building a secondary, more powerful promise. The best and easiest example of this is While You Were Sleeping, the romantic comedy. The promise is she's going to fall in love with perfect man who's lost his memory. And through the course of the story, you as a reader, or as a viewer, fall in love instead with the dopey brother that she's spending all the time with. And so at the end, when you break the promise of her falling in love with the big perfect man and instead falling in love with the dopey brother, you feel like you have gotten more than you were promised. So whenever you break a promise, the easiest and most satisfying way to do it is to give the reader more. More than they were expecting, a better conclusion they were expecting, a larger scope. That's not the only way to do it. Someone else who's really good at this is Stephen Sondheim. I don't know if you guys have watched Into the Woods. But Into the Woods is playing with your preconceptions of what a fairy tale is and upending all of those. And in that case, the promise is we're going to upend all of this. And the way he does it is by first showing you the perfect fantasy world that's cliche, and then showing you the cracks in it. So you begin to say, I want this to break. I didn't realize it when I started, but by the midpoint, I'm happy when it breaks. Giving the reader more than they expect. Other ways to do it, that's the one I would recommend to practice first.
Yes. What would you say that the plot archetypes of the Song of Ice and Fire?
Oh boy. I'm going to say that at least of the first book, there's too many going on for me to talk about. The first book is the same as the Sondheim I just gave you, where what George does very quickly is he establishes classic fantasy archetypes, shows you the flaws in those archetypes, and so that when they break and they're upended, part of you is like, no, my perfect fantasy archetype, but a larger part of you is like, I've been waiting for this for years, and I didn't realize it because it's way cooler when everything falls apart and breaks. And I would say one of the big archetypes is the classic sort of family of heroes drama, right? Where a lot of fantasy will set up, here is the patriarchal man, here is the young kid, in this case Bran, right? Who's going to be, you know, has a mystical future, and is going to become our protagonist. And here's the young, upright son, and by the end of the Red Wedding, they're all broken or dead, right? And what he's promised you is that this is going to be messy, and this is going to break your understandings, but you're going to get something cooler because of it. I wouldn't necessarily know exactly which plot archetype he's doing. I think he's more going for just the sense of different progresses and weaving them together, and not everything has to have one. Like I said, Yasna and Shalon, I didn't use one of these. I used only these. And a lot of books you'll find using only these, and different writers have different methods, so that's what I would answer there.
What do you think about the storytelling of David Lynch?
David Lynch is really interesting. I'm not sure if I can wrap my mind around David Lynch, right? I've enjoyed a number of his creations. He's going for more a surrealist sort of thing, and I tend to look at market-friendly kind of classic tropes and archetypes and storytelling, and he is not doing any of those. He's doing some of them, just enough to make you keep coming back for progress. But I would say to understand what David Lynch is doing, you need to study the surrealists rather than the realists and things like that, which is where I more am. So you'd have to ask him. All right, go ahead.
What are your working habits and like that? And are you sometimes getting tired of like?
Yes. So my working habits as a writer are that I get up at noon because I'm a writer, right? I get up at noon and I usually work for about 4 to 5 hours. And then I go play with and hang out with my family, take a shower, get ready for the day. All that stuff happens at 5. From 5 until 9 is family time. And I've had to put a strict barrier that that is only family time. That if I do anything else, if I do any work at that time, it'll take over. This is really handy for those of you who have a significant other, a family, a spouse. Learning to turn off the writing and be with your spouse is really important, guys. If you don't do this, then what will happen is you will find that your spouse starts to get sort of subconsciously, usually they feel jealous of the attention you're giving the writing, and they won't want to do this intentionally. It's not like they're bad people, they're wonderful people, they love you, but if they can tell, like when you're supposed to be with them, you're instead in your fantasy world, that starts to create friction. The #1 source of divorce among my writer friends is this exact thing, is the spouse feeling like they're not a part of the life, that the writers all go out to dinner and talk writing and the spouse vanishes, that the writer's never there. And if you can set some strict barriers between that, and you can also, if you happen to be a spouse or if you want to talk to your spouse, the thing they can most do to help and to bring them part of it is have them be in charge of guarding your writing time when you have it, so that nothing interrupts you during that time. In exchange, you promise that when you're with them, you'll be with them. And that gives them just a little bit of a part in it, and it's really helpful. If their job is to make sure nobody bothers you for 2 hours while you're writing, and in turn, when you go to dinner with them, you are there with them and not somewhere else, it will make so much better relationship. So I go back to work then at 10 o'clock, and I write till 2, and then I have goof off time from 2 to 4. Video game, third person. Okay. When do I use third person and first person? Probably a bit too big a topic to get into now. Just a few rules of thumb. First person tends to work better for small casts of viewpoint characters. Third person tends to work better for large casts of viewpoint characters. First person tends to be much better at a character study on one individual, and tends to be much stronger with having a really powerful voice for one character. Third person tends to work better if you, again, want a large cast, or if you're going to be jumping around in space and time. The biggest key difference is first person doesn't repeat the character's name, so they'll just start thinking of this character as protagonist. They are the protagonist. Third person repeats the name a bunch. First person, though, lets you use their voice a little bit more. So, all right.
Just one brief interjection.
Yes.
This is a reminder. A question is a single sentence with a question mark at the end.
Yes. All right, go ahead. No, in the back. I've already done with row 2, sorry.
How do you feel
a character. How do I feel when I'm killing a character? So this is kind of good sometimes. Mostly with me, I don't think of it as killing characters. I think of it as letting characters take chances and risks, and then not always withholding the consequences of those. Because I do it all like this, and I know who the characters are, I know the risks that they're willing to take, I know where they're going, and I know what they're going to go through, and their willingness then to make that sacrifice. And I just let the story play out. In the stories I write, they generally are, but they don't have to be. In George Martin's stories, sometimes deaths are quick and brutal. And depends on the type of story you're doing. My promises generally are promises if somebody's going to die, you're going to have a moment with them, and we're gonna see them fulfilling or not fulfilling something. But that's just different for each time. I don't usually feel bad because I've outlined it usually years ahead, and so I've been planning it. All right. Wait, what's that?
Premeditated murder.
Premeditated murder. Yeah. Go ahead.
And how much editing will the editor change your original book?
How much editing does the editor change? I did it on Elantris. I once did a contract changes to compare the first draft to the last draft, and we had changed between myself and my editor around 40% of the text. These days, I would say it's probably around 20 to 30%. So, yeah, we're gonna go right here.
So I want to write about a character with a mental illness, and I'm really afraid that might, color the mental illness problematically. And I read about Calvin, and only later did I realize what happened. So how did you do that?
So if you want to cover mental illness or any other sensitive topic, your best bet is to get some very sensitive readers who deal with whatever issue you're writing about, and first talk to them. Ask them what people get wrong if they're willing to talk to you about it. Make sure you don't do those things. Then try some scenes and give it to them and let them give you advice. This is, I think, a good thing to do. It's good to be thinking about, but you want to do it sensitively, like you're saying. So involving some help and practicing getting better as a writer is also really handy. Some of these early things you write that are dealing with mental illness, you may not be as sensitive as you want to be. It's okay, you're a new writer. In Elantris, I was not nearly as good at dealing with autism as I am by the time I got to the Stormlight Archive. And you can compare the character of autism in Elantris with Renarin and see I'm much better at handling this issue. Don't beat yourself up too much, but also you are fortunate in that your early stuff may not end up getting published, and you may not want to publish your early attempts at this just as you learn how to write. So,
how do you pick names for characters? Because most of my challenge in writing is to pick names that has meaning.
So, easy way to hack this if you're having a lot of trouble with it. If you're writing fantasy, pick a real-world culture linguistically that you're going to base the linguistics of your story on. Find a list of baby names in that language you don't speak. Start playing with those till you find ones that sound right, and always go back to that list for that culture and pick 3 or 4 different cultures and do that. If you really want to go further than that, you can start getting into linguistics and building your own linguistics. But at the end of the day, stress this less than you probably are. Start using a name. What I say is write for a few chapters with it. If it still stands out, put a different name in. Eventually get one that just works for you and for your readers. Don't stress it as much as you probably are.
Thank you.
All right, down this row. All right, right there.
How do you have an idea for a story? And you talk about how you get past the writing block, but how do you just have an idea and start writing it?
How do you have an idea and start writing it for a story? So usually stories are more than one idea for me. The best thing that happens for me is when 2 ideas smash together and become a better idea apart. A large number of my ideas come from watching a show or movie and saying either, wow, that was brilliant, I want to do something like that, or wow, they screwed that up, I can do it better. What went wrong? And going back to the chef thing and trying to figure out what went wrong with their story. Another big source of stories is that I read something about a character's journey and struggle and say, wow, that's a really interesting conflict for that character. I'm going to take that character and start wondering, what would I do with that conflict? And things like this. And these all go in a big file of ideas I want to use sometime, and they'll start to combine together. And they'll start to work together and become, for instance, I had the idea of, a world where the hero lost You know, Harry Potter got to the end of the Harry Potter series and Voldemort killed him and took over the world. What happens then? That was a cool idea. I filed that away, and eventually I was watching one of my favorite movies, Sneakers, which is a heist movie, and said, wow, I love heist stories. Why have I never written one of these? And then I put those two together and they became Mistborn, right? And so just be watching. Ideas are not as hard as you think they are. If you are doing this, if you're watching movies and saying, wow, I love this movie, how can I do something like that? But strip away all the trappings and make it my own, you will never lack for ideas again. All right, go ahead.
In short, what is your editing process? And like, what are you looking for?
So my editing process usually is an outline. I keep a list of all the things I want to change. I have a list of all the things my editor wants me to change. I build a big file out of them where I list all of the things that need to happen to the book, and then I take and I arrange them by importance, and then I put subheadings underneath them, like bullet points of, this is what I'm going to change to fix this. This, and this chapter. And I come up with a big outline for my revision, and then I start on page 1, and I look to cross things off that list. And things at the bottom that are less important I may not get to. They may move to the top of the list next time. I do a draft, but each draft is kind of like that. It's like creating a list of bugs in a program that you're going to fix. It's important, usually, to give yourself time away from the book. Write your book, your story, give it to some alpha readers, let them read it, bring the story back to you, give you feedback, do it some more, write something else, and maybe 6 months after you finished it, you'll have all this together. You can compile it into your own revision plan, decide what you want to change and what you don't, and then go forward, okay? All right, this row, we're going to go right here. Sorry, I can't get to everyone. We are down to, what, like 10 minutes? Yeah, 8 minutes, so go ahead.
So if you're writing and you get stuck and you put something in the story just doesn't work, where do you look to identify the problem?
Where do I look to identify a story that's broken, what the problem is? A lot of these things I'm talking about here have become troubleshooting methods. I will go and say, okay, I'm having trouble with this plot cycle. What was my promise, my payoff, what's not working there maybe? I often have early readers read it and tell me what they think. If you're an early reader, you give an early reader, try to have them not try to fix the story, try to have them just identify the problem. Because a lot of times you'll think the problem is one thing, but they're like, man, I'm just so bored by this character. And you're like, oh, I just realized that the character is not active. They're not doing anything. So the reader's bored because the character stands around. And if I just change it so they make the decisions, suddenly the story is really active and feels very fun and they're no longer boring. You didn't change their voice, you didn't change their plot, you just had them make the decision instead of other people. Things like that. Giving it to readers to have them identify, what's boring them, what's confusing them, and learning to get an instinct for that. This takes years of practice, of writing something, giving it to readers, getting feedback, changing it, giving it to readers, seeing if what your changes fix things or if it made it worse, and learning to troubleshoot that way. Just do it a lot. Just practice a lot. That's the real secret to almost every writing answer, is practice it a lot. All right, we're going to go back into the row. So not you, I'm sorry, with the shaved head and behind. I'm sorry, I can't get to everybody.
I'm curious if you apply these or other methodologies when you're writing lectures.
When I'm writing lectures, yeah. Lectures are basically a list of goals and bullet points. If you looked at my lecture notes, it would just look like this. So by now I've done them enough that, that I can kind of on the fly, but originally that's what they are. And even still, if I build a new lecture, that's what they are. The progress, payoff, and promise thing is something I really hit on a couple years ago, so it's not in my early lectures, and I had to build a new one for that. So, all right, right here in the beard.
How do you handle derailing from the plot? I mean, you have some plot points and you just derail.
Just derail. So what I usually do is one of two things. Either I go and look at where I'm going and decide, am I excited by it? Is it working? If it is, I rebuild my outline using the derail and I write that story. If the derail is completely off target and it really feels like the story isn't working, I take all of those chapters, I put them in a file with this was really cool but not for this book, and I go back to where the beginning of the derail and I go back on target, and I'll identify what I loved about this derailing later, pull that out, and turn it into a new story.
Thank you.
All right, right behind me. Yes.
So, what is the very first thing that you, if you want to create a new story, what is the very first thing that you would do? Like, the very first.
Very first thing that I do. So it's hard to say because the very first thing I'm doing is I'm identifying a story I like and filing in my brain, I want to do something like that. But that's probably not what you're asking. The first thing I type is plot, setting, character in a new document. I make those headings in my outline using the document map in Microsoft Word. And then I start filling in all the things I've been thinking about for years as I've been planning this book, all the powerful moments. So probably the first thing is the powerful moments. That's the first thing, and I write a few paragraphs about each of those and why this makes me want to write this book. All right, we're going to go in the way back last row. Go ahead.
Thanks. Do you have any tips or advice regarding world building on the scale of multiverse, like huge project management?
Yes, multiverse world building, too big a topic for right now. I would say go read Sanderson's Laws. I've got 3 essays, particularly the third one of Sanderson's Laws, which talks about going deep into a topic rather than going wide. If you want something to feel big and multiverse spanning, oftentimes taking one concept and doing it really well across a bunch of different cultures is going to serve you better than trying to do 10% on 10 different cultures. So go read that essay, okay?
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. All right, last one in the back corner. Okay, yes, go ahead.
Me?
Yep.
What is the archetype of Elantris?
What is the what? The archetype of Elantris? Yeah. So Elantris started life, it has 3 different archetypes. So, Serene is a whodunit. Who killed my husband? Straight up murder mystery plot where she uncovers the true nature of what's going on in Wraithen. Wraithen's plot is, I'm not sure if there's a straight one I could say. He's trying to convert the world. It's basically, you know what it is? It's a heist. It's a one-person heist. He's going to try to convince everyone in the city that these people are evil and he's the only one that can save them for them. And he's building different ways to do this and different plans. And then Raoden's plot archetype is turf war. It's where I, as a newcomer, have to conquer these 3 kingdoms. And the 3 kingdoms are just ruled by the 3 people who rule Elantris. And he's going to beat each of them in a different way. It's almost like a Shoujo manga, what Raoden is doing, except without the fighting. It's I'm going to beat this boss, and this boss, and then the city is mine, and I can then escape us from the city. He's also got a subplot that's a mystery plot of what went wrong with the magic, which is what comes out more and more the further he goes, which is kind of his real plot, but the beat the 3 bosses, the Shoujo manga thing is his progress. That's what you're watching to see where he's going. All right, guys, I am out of time. My voice is going. Answers for all of you. If you ever happen to be in Provo, Utah, on Thursday nights, you can come sit in on my class at BYU. So you can get more of this if you want, but I'm all on YouTube. So thank you guys very much. Take care.